Now let's get started. I'm excited to introduce the first panel topic. Equity and access impacts so many aspects of our daily lives, and that's no different for future mobility. Our panel will explore how future mobility technologies can be used to improve equity and access for underserved communities. Our moderator is Mariah Lichtenstern, the founding partner of Diverse City Ventures, managing director of the Founder Institute Sacramento chapter, and advisor for CalSeed's Clean Tech Fund. And that's just dipping a toe into the ocean of Mariah's impact in both our local community as well as the national one. Mariah, welcome to the Zoom stage. It's all yours.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Laura, and thank you to you and Jeff, the sponsors in the city of Sacramento, for making this possible. And thank you to for our luminary guests or panelists who I see are joining now. So if you saw me light up, it's because I see their images popping up on the screen there. So we're here today to discuss future mobility access and equity, and focusing on mobility in underserved communities specifically, and using new mobility to improve equity. So let's just start off with introductions. Why don't each of you just spend a minute or two introducing yourselves, your organization and its goals, and why the work that you do is meaningful to you.
I'll go ahead and start. I'm Alana Mathews. I am currently the Chief Consultant for the Joint Legislative Committee on Climate Change Policies. So I enjoy doing that in the legislature, which takes a look at what are the priority issues facing or related to climate change that we should focus on. But I will say that prior to that, I was the former public advisor at the California Energy Commission and really worked on some landmark efforts to include equity in our clean energy policy. And I am also founder of an organization called the Community Justice Collaborative, and we focus on environmental justice efforts here locally.
And Jose, how about we jump over to you?
Thanks, Mariah, and thanks to the panelists for the opportunity. My name is Jose Bodipo-Memba. I am the Director for Sustainable Communities for SMUD. Our mission really is ensuring that every one of our customers has an opportunity to live the best quality of life possible. We believe by having access to social well-being, access to healthy environment, access to economic opportunity, and last, in what we're discussing today, access to mobility options and environmentally friendly ones really will provide every community with what they need. So our real goal is to target the entire community, but provide specific focus for the most underserved communities. So I'm excited about this call today. This is a passion project because, again, most of the people that I grew up with and that I've taught in my prior career were in situations that like we're discussing now. And we realize that we have to provide opportunities for folks to be able to lift themselves up and provide themselves the best life possible. So this is really exciting conversation. Thank you.
Awesome. And then Simeon?
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for having us here. I started Green Tech in 2008. And again, my name is Simeon Gant, the founder and executive director of Green Technical Education and Employment. And our goal has always been to really provide education to our youth and young adults about this new clean energy economy. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in terms of how we've brought our young people into the fold, but to really engage in how we can inform and make our community a lot more conscious about how we can improve our environment and our overall health care.
Thank you. And last but not least, is it Raef?
Raef, yep.
Raef, yes.
Yeah, you got it. Yeah, so I'm Raef Porter. I am the Transportation and Climate Change Program Manager at the Sacramento Air District. We oversee really the health of all of the breathers in the Sacramento Air Basin. My role specifically is overseeing projects related to vehicle incentives. So how do we clean up the vehicles that are out there, but also how do we provide mobility options to really everyone in the region? But how can we do that in an efficient, effective, and equitable manner? And so we oversee a bunch of programs on that. And want to thank the panelists for letting me be a part of this. Feel very distinguished and probably a little unworthy, but hopefully I think it's going to be a great conversation and looking forward to be part of it. Thanks.
You are all amazing and distinguished guests, and it's just an honor to be here among you. So thank you for making the time to enrich our community in addition to the work that you're already doing. So just getting started, I'm gonna pass the mic over to Alana here. I know that you led the California Energy Commission's SB 350 barrier study that looked into barriers to clean energy opportunities in underserved communities. So can you just speak to the findings there and how they pertain to mobility?
Sure. So let me just give you a very quick little bit of background on that. That came out of the Clean Energy and Pollution Reduction Act of 2015, where the state set a number of priorities for reduction of greenhouse gases. And a part of that was to commission this report for the barriers. So the Energy Commission was focused on the barriers to renewable technology, weatherization investments and programs, and then contracting opportunities for clean energy to those who are in disadvantaged communities. And then the California Air Resources Board, they were tasked with looking at the barriers in transportation. So we did work very, very closely together, but the transportation sector or portion of that barriers report was really led by the California Air Resources Board. And they came up with pretty much 6 recommendations and to the barriers that they discovered. And those recommendations were to lead to a pathway of greater access. So those included expanded assessment of low-income residents to the transportation options that they have, but making sure that there was an expanded assessment so they could get that feedback to incorporate that into programs and policies. They also recommended having expanded outreach because they found that many residents didn't know what their options were. So it was just a lack of awareness and information. The third was developing a one-stop shop, so that if there's a rebate program here or there's another incentive program here, like you don't know what organizations or utilities or government is sponsoring that. So let's just have like one stop, whether that be on a virtual platform or a brick and mortar, but one place people could go to kind of take advantage of all of the programs that were available. And then developing guiding principles that would give technical assistance if you're going to apply for a grant or something like that. And then, of course, maximizing opportunities for those who are in low-income communities to getting those benefits and looking at the mobility options by expanding workforce training development programs. So it's not enough just to bring the technology to the community, but all the people who are working, building the infrastructure can benefit economically because poverty and pollution go hand in hand. So as we want to clean the air and clean access, we also want to, clean the economic barriers that have been in the way as well. And then lastly, it was expanding funding opportunities and financing clean transportation mobility projects. So again, that goes to infrastructure as well as actual cars to help meet the mobility needs.
That's excellent. Thank you for sharing that information with us. So we're going to move to Raef. And you said something interesting in our previous conversation. So this is kind of building up on that. So oftentimes when we discuss underserved communities, it's framed as though the residents are somehow to blame. But when we look into systemic factors, it can feel like, we're preaching to the choir, right? So you mentioned the role of redlining and creating inequities. And I would just love for you to share with us how that relates to access to mobility from your perspective and how that informs the work that you do.
Yeah, well, thank you. Great question. So I think we all historically know, practices like redlining and what they were trying to do, and it was really just about segregating people and providing an opportunity for some and not providing an opportunity for others. Following on that was, policies and practices around things like infrastructure and investing in certain areas, and then again, not investing in others. And so with that, you had a lack of things like sidewalks and street crossings, shade trees, things that made it very accessible to get to mobility. So even if we are able to do things like have bike share and car share and different mobility and transit options in certain neighborhoods, without some of that underlying infrastructure, those mobility options really aren't viable. I can't imagine, riding a bike, for example, down Florin Road. Why would I want to do that. So if you put a bunch of jump bikes there, it might not be that really that equitable of a solution if you don't have the underlying infrastructure. And a lot of that is based on these old practices that we've had, like redlining. So not only does it affect things like housing, it affects things like people's access to mobility. So these solutions not only have to be equitable in how you place them, but you need to look at a lot of the underlying issues that are there, and things like land use practices and the infrastructure that we're able to put in certain areas really drive a lot of those mobility options for people. And if you just don't have that because of the lack of infrastructure based on historic underfunding of infrastructure in certain areas, those mobility options just aren't going to work. So that's something that we're looking at the Air District, is not only can we provide things like our community car share and clean cars for all, so we can make sure that those mobility options are there, but what really is underlying that mobility option, and how do you have that equitable access to that? Again, if it's something like bike share, do we have things like safe bike routes and infrastructure that people can bike safely? If it's our community car share, do you actually have the ability to get to that car share? Are there shade trees? Is there charging infrastructure even available? So we can put them out there, but it's not necessarily going to work. So we have to look at those underlying issues, and that's what we're trying to do with the Air District as well.
Thank you so much for sharing that. You know, I have lived in communities that were part of these historical, barriers, and I did not know for many years. It was a process of learning. So thank you for taking the time to share that, and it's good to know that you're factoring that into the work that you do. So next, Simeon. This was an interesting fun fact about you. You served as a legislative consultant for nearly 2 decades, and I'm telling you, you must be sipping oil of Olay or something. But how do your experiences in that position inform how green tech empowers youth and young adults in pursuing careers that can advance their access and equity in these underserved communities we've been discussing?
Well, thank you, Mariah. One thing I did learn is that drinking a lot of water keeps you young looking. So it helps the skin. Water. The environmentalists, they preach water. Well, it's a good reason. So I do believe in it. Yeah, I did work in the legislature for a long time, and there was a time when we had these blackouts, right? I think it was around 2000. And I was doing a lot of policy work in foster care and social services and criminal justice work at the time. And I thought that this energy piece is going to be big one day. It's not for me right now. Fast forward, after having worked in the community, I worked both in the legislature, but I also worked in Oakland for a state senator in the community in Oakland. And so I got an opportunity to see, working class neighborhoods, some of the things that they go through. There's a lot of challenges. And so just fast forwarding, after AB 32 came out in 2006, and recognize there's going to be some big changes in how we develop our infrastructure. And I thought at the time, by then I had worked in the legislature, like you said, for almost 2 decades, and realized, let me do something different. Let me do something.
I'm having a bit of a hard time hearing you, Simeon. I don't know if it's just me.
Uh-oh. Is my audio gone? Can't hear me?
Mariah, it might be you, Mariah. I can hear you.
Yeah, I can hear you just fine.
Okay. All right. So yeah, my story is, I just, in 2006, after reading the Global Warming Solutions Act, recognizing that the state of California is going green and that there needed to be a definition of what that is. And I looked around, I did a lot of studying, and I recognized that our community, specifically the Black community, we needed something, an apparatus to be able to teach us and tell us what is this going green, or what is this environmental protection movement all about? And at the time we were in a recession. And so I recognized that folks needed jobs too. And then really looking at what was happening in this Global Warming Solutions Act, there was 5 specific industries that would be affected and impacted. And one was transportation. Of course, there was construction, utilities, overall environmental management, and the manufacturing industry. And I created a curriculum, and I started talking to our young people working with my fraternity. We had a mentorship program. I'd go talk to the kids about it. They were all in because they were going to be the ones who were going to have to implement all of this stuff. Just fast forward, we did a solar suitcase project, so we kind of introduced them to solar. Our students here got an opportunity to learn electrical circuitry and solar, but also it was a portable lighting system that we were able to send to Haiti and to Africa to where they needed, where the lighting was poor. The grid was very unreliable. And so we did that project. Moving forward, we've had other projects. We've had construction projects, teaching our young people kind of the basics of building things. And now moving forward with the thanks of the Air Quality Management District and my good friend Gina O'Neill over there, who is now the guru, I have to tell you, of the electrified transportation, as well as hydrogen transportation, zero emissions transportation. So now we're not just talking to our students about it, we're actually demonstrating how this works, while at the same time actually mitigating the harms and damages that we're doing to our environment. And so we have this, thanks to the city of Sacramento, who gifted us property on the corner of Grand and May. We're gonna pave that over, put a parking lot there. We're gonna invest in Del Paso Heights by using, we have 8 hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. We're gonna have several electric cars over there, and we're gonna pick up people in the community, specifically partnering with the Black Child Legacy Campaign, picking up single moms who are struggling to get from one place to another, struggling to get to doctor's visits, struggling to get to work. We're gonna pick up Green Tech students who can't really get to our location to get the training, and we're gonna pick them up in zero emissions vehicles. New innovative technology, historically, as Raef mentioned earlier, the redlining and the lack of investments in our working class communities, Green Tech is poised to help bring some of those investments with the assistance, of course, of the Air Quality Management District, the assistance of SMUD. We've got some assistance from the Tides Foundation, the California Endowment, and we still need more, because we're saying, look, all these years and years of lack of investment in these communities has had a detrimental effect, and it affects all of us. And so if we want to fix the problem, we're going to have to invest in the problem. And that's what Green Tech is here to do.
That is so powerful and really inspiring and encouraging to hear. And I'm in District 2, so I'll be looking forward to seeing some of those changes. I'm not all the way over there, but I'm off El Camino. So
I have to just say, one of those things is folks, have always said, well, Green Tech is an Oak Park organization. And I like to remind people that what Green Tech is about is working class, those who are in need all over the city of Sacramento. It's South Sacramento, it's Oak Park, it's Del Paso Heights. So we're kind of just moving in, but we're moving in to come help.
Yeah, and let's not forget, and there's Meadowview, and there's other communities that are under-resourced and not thought of. I think of areas adjacent to old bases. So that's, and to your point, and I'm from Oakland, so that resonated, but there's this transfer too. The work that's done here by all of you influences what's happening in other urban areas, and that's an example. So just really, really excited to hear about each of your initiatives. So Jose, last but not least on telling us more about yourself. Now you have you have some slides that you wanted to share, is that right?
Sure, but I mean, you can ask your question, because I'm pretty sure what you're asking actually will speak to what I want to share. So
perfect. Okay, wonderful. So as the Director of Sustainable Communities at SMUD, what role do or should utilities like SMUD play in addressing access and equity when it comes to future mobility? And, again, feel free to share any historical or current context. And this just speaks to the point that, this can be influential to cities even across the nation. So love to hear from you.
I appreciate that, and feel honored to follow all of these speakers, and again, the work Simeon does on the ground. I'm really glad to be a part. SMUD's really glad to be a part of that. Ultimately, what you talked about, Mariah, what role do utilities play? If a utility like SMUD is a leader, we define ourselves that way, we have to lead by action. And one of the reasons why the Sustainable Communities Initiative was even started is that our keynote speaker today, Arlen Orchard, is our recently retired general manager who really made a commitment to really equitable treatment of all of our community members in what we do. And our new CEO, Paul Lau, is continuing that legacy and that process. And I'm just honored to sit in the seat to be able to put some of these projects to work and work with folks like Simeon and others, and Raef and Alana. So to answer the question, what should utilities do? I think leverage their resources, leverage their skill set, information, data, to be able to provide support for partners in the community and really be innovators. So one way SMUD's done that, and I'll go ahead and share my screen real quickly, is we've taken some of that data, and let me know if you can see this here, is we've actually created what's called a Sustainable Communities Resource Priorities Map. And what it does is it takes key information and data about disadvantaged communities, vulnerability to climate change, poverty information, promise zone information, and takes all that data into account to really identify where are those specific neighborhoods that are most impacted by those external influences that we've all discussed beforehand. But what we're able to do, back to Simeon's point and others, is take that data to help us prioritize where those investments happen. And Alana mentioned this before. It's not just about putting businesses there, but creating infrastructures where the community members can actually feed into it. So specifically, as we relate to this conversation today about innovation in transportation, let's just take some information related to EVs as being an innovative state. We have here listed on the map all of the public EV stations located within Sacramento County. And areas that are located in the darkest red are the areas that are most impacted, most sensitive from a sustainable communities perspective. So you can see right here, we aren't investing in those neighborhoods with that advanced technology. And I'll take a little bit closer. So there's nothing happening, like you said, in Oak Park. That's why we're working with Simeon and working with others to make that happen. So I'll just pull it back again. What we're able to do with that information is work with the city of Sacramento and with the air district. So Raef and their team, they've identified some initial priority areas, but still now we can actually focus a little bit more on specific quadrants within Del Paso Heights, within Fruit Ridge Manor, even out in some of our new growth areas in the Southeast, to be able to make sure we really provide equitable access. And of course, SMUD provides the infrastructure for that process. We have, in our integrated resources plan, we have specific dollars set aside to focus and prioritize implementation and of new infrastructure for future innovation in those areas. The other thing that I'll leave the map up for a few more seconds that we leverage this map for is for one of SMUD's proudest projects is the California Mobility Center. We are the seed funder for that program. That is a program that will bring innovation in transportation to this region and make Sacramento the capital of that innovation space. We actually use this info to make sure the programs are located in one of our underserved communities, but then to Alana's point, we're working with community partners to make sure that the workforce is being trained right now to be able to prepare for that future innovation skill set. We want to make sure that our community members can not just participate, but lead in those spaces. And so again, this map is publicly available. I can put it in a link for folks to use it because it's a resource for folks to better understand their community and their needs. But the reality is we believe that SMUD and every other utility and every other agency that calls themselves a leader in the region should figure out what their best skill set is, whether it is data, whether it is finances, whether it is community access, to be able to really make sure as we recover, it's equitably done. Because if we don't, we saw what happened from 2006 to 2016. We had the biggest disparity gap in the US for a city of our size in terms of the increase. We have to make sure we're intentional in terms of how we do this work. I'm really glad to be working with everyone here on the panel to do that.
Wow, that just really makes it plain. That really does. You guys have me here in all the feels. So now we kind of have a lay of the land and a bit of what each of you are doing. So let's go a little bit deeper in, and this is for all of you. What are the gaps between where we are now and what we need to achieve in equity and mobility? And what would you like to see happen? And what do we want to avoid? So you'll feel free, anyone, to jump in.
I'll just jump in and start from the policy perspective. it's really important and even programmatic is to prioritize equity. So often it's like an afterthought, or we tokenize it and we designate a certain percentage and we say, we'll, kind of work on this as we put it in, include it in part of a larger plan. But we need to prioritize the more vulnerable communities precisely because they are more vulnerable. And I should say, I should have started off with this, which normally I do. I do not like the term disadvantaged communities because I think it's pejorative and I hate it. But in the barrier study, it was referenced. And so I'm so glad when Mr. Porter brought up redlining, because that happened in housing, but certainly there are a number of federal programs and state programs that follow this kind of discriminatory practice. So I think we have to prioritize and say, when we're talking about equity, how is it that we serve these organizations? And I'll just give you an example of how to make it concrete, because we say priorities, but prioritize, but that's sort of abstract. So we know under Jim Crow South, there were whites only water fountains and then colored water fountains, right? And so if there was a sign that said whites only, we knew that's blatantly discriminatory. So when we're thinking about programs and products, or how we're doing it, you have to think about, can African Americans access that? Can Latino Americans access that? Can low income residents access that? And if it doesn't, it doesn't mean that just because you don't have a sign that you haven't created that inequity. So if it's only located in a place or only accessible to certain people, you might as well have that same sign over it. So that's sort of a guidepost. If anytime you're having a program or a policy or anything, if you want to know if it's equitable, ask yourself that question. And what do you need to do in order to make it equitable? And if that means, well, we need more investments, we need to connection, or we need to do whatever, we need to bring that workforce development, we need to make the training, whatever you need to do, then that's going to be your guidepost to making it equitable.
I'd like to piggyback off of what Alana said, and I agree with you. I don't like the term disadvantaged communities. I talk about under-resourced, underserved communities, because that's the reality of where it is. But like she said, SB 535 has it in the name, sometimes we have to say it. But I think that building off of what Alana said, it's imperative that we don't overlook the unintended consequences of good ideas. So for example, when we start talking about EVs and placement, there's an education component that has to happen. I know in the work that we've done, a lot of folks say, why do you care about EVs? I can't afford a Tesla. That's not what I'm worried about. But if you realize that the air quality in those same corridors I showed you are amongst the worst in the city, in the region, and by removing some of those vehicle trips off the road, that can actually improve their quality of life, their lifespan, their child's performance, their risk of asthma, we have to be able to draw those connections as to why. The other piece is too, and again, this might be slightly controversial, ride share and car share, great ideas, but particularly as we've seen in the COVID context, when we are only depending upon some of these shared modes of transportation, it's those individuals who have the least amount of resources who are most at risk. So how do we make sure that we're thinking through all of those processes, not just leading with the environmental lens, but leading with that equity lens, like Alana said, really figuring out what's most important, and then how do we communicate it? The literal language and the figurative languages in which we communicate these messages are extremely important, and making sure it happens at the level, at the spaces and places where people work, play, walk, and travel. I think it's imperative for us to move forward effectively and do it in an equitable manner.
I'd like to build on that as well, and kind of borrow something that Jose said earlier, and that's just we have to be intentional about this. As an agency that has resources available, if we just peanut butter those resources around and provide an equitable solution for everybody, that's not addressing it at all. We need to be intentional about how we think about this. And these areas have been, traditionally and chronically underserved. We need to make sure that they actually have, an equitable access to that. And so, again, we need to look at our resources and say, how can we provide it? And so in these communities that have been ignored, what are we going to do there? Again, we can't just go in and throw a solution. As Jose just mentioned, there's a lot of unintended consequences. So we need to work with those in those areas and say, what are the solutions? We have to be culturally sensitive. We have to look at the underlying issues. We have to look at what solutions might actually work for them. Providing a bike share that only goes a couple of miles might not get them to their job, to their services, get their kids to school, things like that. So we need to look at what are the real needs in that community and how do we do it, and then be intentional about how we invest in those communities.
And Simeon, did you want to add to?
Oh, I just want to jump on the, I hate the word disadvantaged community bandwagon for sure. We kind of go over that so much on my team, and I've started to use the term working class community more. It may not still fully identify the communities that we're talking about. Hate to use the word low income community, but to some extent that is the reality, is that it's just economically disadvantaged or economically low. However, a lot of those folks are working, right? And they still can't, they're still having a hard time making a living. So I consider them working class. But, and that's where the gap continues to be is economically. Part of the deal, the original idea for bringing this mobility hub to Del Paso Heights, in my mind, was to help people get to jobs. We know that a lot of folks in the Heights, they might actually work somewhere in Rancho Cordova. They might work at Apple way out in Elk Grove, but they can't get there, and so we just want to be able to kind of support that to the best way we can. As mentioned here earlier, COVID has changed a lot. We've been fortunate that the vehicles that we have now are they're hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, and we can't get a bunch of people in there. They're very small. And so the goal is to have drivers, and we're not going to have more than 2 or 3 people in those vehicles. And so some of those things, and things are changing all the time, and we've got to make adjustments to those changes. And that's going to be the best way to fill the gaps. But what we know is still that since the folks are economically challenged, we've got to figure out ways to try to meet those challenges.
Can I just add 2 things very quickly? The first thing is kind of going back to the problem that we have with some of the terminology and how we refer to certain communities. And that is because there is still this stigma. It's sort of, if you live in a low income community or you don't have as many opportunities, there's this thinking that you did something to cause this. You've made choices, and that's why. And it completely ignores the systemic and structural racism that is a big contributor of why those communities exist, why they are overburdened with pollution, why there's less economic opportunities. And, we can't just be in a bubble, right? We're in a moment of racial reconciliation in our country. And so this is a way to kind of acknowledge that. Whether there's a proposition or a legislative, response to this, that's the reality. And so when we talk about that, it's not just a matter of semantics and like that doesn't sound right or it makes me feel a certain way. It's ignoring a reality that if you don't acknowledge it, you can't address it. And you can't build a program that is truly equitable. The other thing I will say is that in addition to being intentional, or part of being intentional is being inclusive. So it's not enough just to say you have to, find a solution that, is directed toward including everybody, but you have to bring those voices to the table. And you have to amplify and elevate that. So that was one of the hallmarks of the SB 350 study, is that we didn't just rely on policy wonks or researchers or scientists. We actually had community meetings and we said, you tell us what you need. So when you're looking at equitable mobility solutions, you need to bring the community to the table and have them explain what it is that we need. Because if you have shared mobility between the hours of 8 and 10, yet I'm working a midnight shift because that's the only job that I can have, and I'm cleaning rooms or whatever I'm doing, or I'm working, security somewhere, how is that going to be available for me? And we typically have a public outreach process that, happens during work hours. So you can't do that. You have to make it available at a time where people can attend. And when they attend, you have to give them opportunity to talk. So with that, I'm going to stop.
So Alana, you open the cage, so I gotta step in there. And again, I'm not gonna toot our horn because obviously we can always do things better. But I think one of the things that SMUD's done well is in our program is really leveraging our community leaders that are already in place, is empowering them to leverage those relationships and really communicate those needs at their level. Because it does not make sense for me, and you can see in my background, it looks like I'm high up in the sky, but literally to look down and say, this is what you need. But it makes more sense to say, if I'm working with this Chamber of Commerce or with a nonprofit like Simeon or with other nonprofits throughout the entire region, to understand and engage and not just listen, but take ideas and be a part of a co-planning process. And we've really found a lot of success in that space where folks have told us, this is what we want, this is what we need, and this is how we can do it together. So I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I think that if we can start to shift from just meeting the minimum criteria of percentages and goals and numbers and so many community meetings, but more about planning together, identifying key goals within the community that lift us all up. And here's the reality. We serve the entire Sacramento County. We want the entire county to be beneficial. We do not want people to have their lifespan determined based off their zip code. And there should be a way to get there safely, environmentally friendly, regardless of whether you're coming from Del Paso Heights down to Meadowview out to Elk Grove. We should be able to do that equally. We have the belief that we can get there, but it's going to take some time, and it's going to take us having to change our mindsets and our process. And then the last thing I would say, as it relates to the innovation process, is also, it's not just encouraging new innovation and investment here, but allowing some of the great innovative spirits that exist in our region to grow. We're working with an amazing robotics program over in South Sacramento. It's headquartered at SES, but from kids from all over South Sac. They're doing awesome work. We want to make sure those folks have an opportunity to work in their neighborhood, in their city, and create those new mobility options of the future.
Awesome. So we have 10 minutes left in our panel. And so I just want to remind the audience to put any questions that they might have into the Q&A box. I'm looking at some of the questions here, and I'm going to prioritize those that I think are most relevant to this discussion. I have one more question, but before we jump into that, I do want to throw out this question from the audience that wants to know what are the primary pollution issues in the areas that we've discussed today. So I don't know if Alana, you want to start, or anyone, I'll throw it out there. What are the primary pollution issues?
So I focus on the statewide level. So what I would be saying is very general, but if Simeon or if Jose or even Raef, if you know, then you can jump in.
Jose may know a little better than myself, but I'll say really, literally at the ground level, we've got some pretty serious dumping, illegal dumping issues that are going on in some of these communities. And a lot of the people are saying it's not them in that community doing it, it's people coming from other communities and dumping. And so that's one of them. And then, we have, a lot of these, we're in industrial areas. So we've got some of these corporations that are polluting. And then we have the freeways. A lot of the freeways are going right through some of these low income communities. And so we have a lot of emissions coming out of these vehicles, internal combustion vehicles, going right through some of these working class communities. So those are kind of three of the bad ones.
And I won't talk about air quality because that's Raef's area, but I will say the map does say, if you go to our map, it does actually identify for each of those neighborhoods all of the pollutant contributors. So everything from PM10 to water quality to asthmatic risk. But Raef, I'm sure you can talk a little bit more about a lot of the air quality issues.
Yeah, and I think Simeon's right. I think a lot of it is transportation, and it gets back to the issues that we've been talking about. These neighborhoods and these communities were built, in the areas that were, quote unquote, undesirable, and then you throw all the other uses there, whether it's the big freeway that bisects the community, or you throw in, all of the auto-oriented uses. So you're getting a lot of transportation-related pollution. And then I think it's not only the pollution, but then it's the exposure piece too. So where's pollution happening? and where is there a lot of exposure. And again, so not having shade trees, and you have a lot of, you know, people that need to take different modes and access public transit, but then they have to walk along these freeways and being exposed to that pollution. So it's there's a lot of sources, and it's concentrated in these areas, and then there is a lack of resources to reduce that exposure to it. So transportation and the land uses that are there are definitely the big contributors.
Well, okay, thank you for answering that. I know with redlining, the freeways being designed to go through some of these communities that were actually at some point doing quite well oftentimes, and eminent domain and the freeways being built was part of the redlining approach to dismantling and disrupting those communities. So you guys have added an additional layer in how the additional consequence of that was the proximity to these pollutants, which hopefully through mobility, we can clear the air with that. I don't mind being close to a freeway, but I don't want the pollution. So in the final question, and I think this somewhat addresses one of the questions from the audience around how do we shape technology that is informed by real social issues and challenges, who in our communities can and should do this. So tying that in with my last question, you know, how do we, we've talked kind of about the mistakes that we can learn from, but describe the future that you want to see and how you think that we can avoid some of these mistakes. And we can start with any of you.
I'll go ahead and start, and then kick it to somebody else. So I would love for our future to be a little bit more nimble. I think that we often get, tied up in these issues. And I think that, we end up focusing resources in particular areas to where we think it might work the best and where the market is going to be for it. And instead of just being willing to try something. And I know that goes against a little bit of what we talked about today, but I think, if we're going to experiment in some of these areas, let's make sure that, as Alana mentioned, we're bringing the people to the table, but let's not get so caught up in a process. Before I was at the Air District, I was the executive director of the Del Paso Partnership. And I think the thing that we heard up there was, we're so tired of having plans. There's been so many plans for, how do you make Del Paso better? And let's plan it and let's study it. And there was never any action. So I think that, there's a lot of people, and I probably can be included in this, that we go into these communities and we talk about these plans and these great things that we're going to do, and then there's never any action. And if we really do have some resources available and we're hearing from the community about what they want, I think we need to be a little bit more nimble and try. And so no matter what the technology is, we need to be, again, intentional with that, with community input, but let's actually make it happen and not just sit there and talk about it and research it.
Okay. Others in the 4 minutes we have left?
I was just, trying to let you guys have a chance. I really would like to see, the information. I really think that the Sustainable Communities Mapping Tool is awesome. Like, heads off. I went through like a training when they first had like a webinar of how to use it, and the data is like got economic data, opportunity zones, medical data. It can be leveraged and used for so many different reasons. But what I'd like to see is as simple as mobility for all Californians. And the reality is that some people don't have mobility. They don't have that option. And when, if you don't own a car, if you don't own a car that has its registration, so it might be a polluter, you might be driving around the neighborhood, but you can't afford that registration, you can't pass smog, so you're, lessening where you're going to. So just being able to have that option is what I would like for people to see. And then and that includes not just vehicles, but active transportation, so that you can take part in just like walking, that's a part of transportation as well, or mobility options, which means you have to have shaded areas, you have to have walkways, you have to have safe and secure neighborhoods, where you're not, facing not only pollution from being outside, but other social injustices like harassment or crime or anything else. So being able to have a holistic approach and not just saying, oh, it's a clean energy vehicle or it's a new pathway, but it's a holistic approach to make sure people are able to move from one place to the next, and do so the same way that anyone else who lives in any other zip code is able to do.
Okay, so in the last 2 minutes, I'm going to throw out this other question that came out from the audience, but feel free to also share your vision for what you want to see in the future. But how are we holding the programs accountable to the community? And I just want to add to that, sometimes when we're just interfacing with leaders, some voices don't get to the table. Sometimes the voices that do get to the leaders are because of some proximity to power. So I think that may be part of this question. So I'll throw that out there, and please, Simeon and Raef, and if there's others that want to address that in the 1 minute.
We just need to be intentional about really being in the community, right? Like there are all sorts of, you know, they have the neighborhood associations. Yeah, that's one way. But, you know, being at the baseball games, being at the basketball games, being, you know, in and around the schools, being there when you're recruiting to bring the voices to the table, you have to actually be in the community to, you know, sometimes you got to go knock on doors, you know. Yep. So, what was that?
Barbershop, beauty salon.
Exactly. Absolutely. You just got to be there. And I think that's my 1 minute answer. Just got to really be intentional and be there.
Sorry, Simeon, didn't mean to jump out. I'll get 25 seconds. I'll give one more shout out to the map. Our goal is to make that whole map green. We're going to make sure we're annually updating it, and the efforts that everyone here on this panel will be reflected in how well our community goes. I think the other piece is we have to make sure that we leverage this technology that we've experienced during the downturn as a means to get more community members involved and engaged. It means cutting the digital inclusion gap to make sure that folks can participate.
Awesome. Okay, any final words? We've been granted a 1 minute grace period. Okay.
Go ahead, Simeon, please.
Shop local. You can drive, you know, you drive less. You shop right around there in Del Paso Heights, right around there. You know, Meadowview's tough right now, but we're working on getting some more stores and things going on over there. There's these food deserts, but just, you know, just shop local.
I want to share just my vision too. I look forward to a time, and I see a future where we're not having to address underserved communities and inequities, where we're looking at, you know, what can we do that's collectively for the benefit of us all, because we've solved for these problems. And so that's a vision that I'd like to seed out there. And I want to thank all of you for contributing. You've been so profound. I had chills. I got all the feels. So thank you so much. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Laura.
Thanks, everyone.
Well, thank you so much, Mariah, Alana, Jose, Raef, and Simeon.